Hey you guys, here we are with another Tomes of Terror book review, and I'm finally getting around to this one. So I had actually been sort of wanting to and looking forward to reading F. Paul Wilson's 1981 novel, The Keep, for quite a while. For several reasons. One, a number of you guys, some listeners out there, had recommended it heartily. I'd heard of it before, but I hadn't read it. Two, I had kind of vague but sort of fond memories of the 1983 Michael Mann film adaptation, although I will admit that I haven't seen it for a long time, so I'm not actually really sure how it holds up. I read a little bit about the Wikipedia page and stuff and about how troubled the production was and how it was initially almost 3 hours long and they cut out all this stuff and it's incomprehensible and stuff like that. So I haven't seen it in a really long time, so I don't know. But I remembered liking it when I saw it back in the 80s. Three, I had actually read another one of F. Paul Wilson's novels. I think it was The Tomb a few years back and enjoyed it quite a bit, although I will admit, again, that I don't recall a great deal about it otherwise. I just have, again, fond memories of it. So The Keep, let me see if I can get this straight, is actually the first in what was originally called the Night World cycle, but eventually came to be called the Adversary cycle. I think that was because a reviewer called, after several of the books had come out, used that phrase, and I guess F. Paul Wilson liked that better, so he actually renamed the series of books because he thought that was a better name. As far as I'm aware, however, and I could be totally wrong about this, so please correct me if I am, The Keep was initially written as a standalone story, and only kind of later became sort of, maybe kind of, retroactively connected to the other 6 books in the Adversary cycle. As I mentioned, I did read The Tomb, which is actually the first book to feature Wilson's iconic character, Repairman Jack, and it's also the second book in the Adversary cycle, but it doesn't have anything to do with The Keep. And the Repairman Jack novels, also, I should say, also he has his own series, which later intertwine with the Adversary cycle. So you have to kind of read them in tandem, I think, at least as far as I'm aware. Confused yet? Me too. So that doesn't have that much to do with this book, because like I said, this is totally standalone. Yes, it leaves it open where it could be opened up to a bigger world, which I'm assuming that it did, but you don't need to have read any of the other books to read this one because it's essentially a standalone story. So The Keep seems to be pretty highly regarded, in horror circles. It appears on several people's and blogs and stuff like that, best horror novels of the 20th century lists, although I will note that it also has its detractors, so, don't think that. It's very much on the sort of mainstream / pulp horror kind of end of the spectrum, with nods to H.P. Lovecraft, for example, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, other kind of writers like that of the kind of golden era of pulp horror and sci-fi. Overall, I was really into the first maybe half to 3/4 of this book, though I did think it weakened a little bit toward the end when it went, spoiler alert, in a little bit more of a dark fantasy type direction. I have liked a handful of dark fantasy or sword and sorcery type, tales in my day, but it's usually not the kind of thing that I would generally seek out. It's not usually the kind of thing that I like. I'm very much a straight up horror person, haunted house, psychological, that kind of stuff, gore. I like that kind of stuff. I don't usually like a lot of sci-fi or fantasy type stuff, although there are exceptions to that rule. So the story of The Keep is set in 1941, in the early days of World War II. Now, in the remote mountains of Romania, there is this small, mysterious fortress, which is simply known as The Keep. It's like a castle, but mini. And it becomes interesting to the Nazi high command for very strategic purposes. It overlooks this past that they think, oh, maybe we'll need that during some whatever. So they want to station some people out there. Now, The Keep's origins are a complete mystery. Nobody knows who built it or exactly how old it is, but it's been maintained in tip-top condition by generations of villagers for centuries. Somebody, nobody knows who, pays this certain family of villagers to keep up stonemasons and stuff like that to keep the thing in top repair, and nobody really knows how, because there's all these kind of different like steps in the process of like how the money gets there. So the man who is initially in command of the German soldiers stationed at the keep, whose name is Captain Klaus Verman, I guess is how you pronounce his name. He's an older guy, and he fought in the First World War, and he's not the biggest fan of like the Nazi Party or Hitler or their death camps or anything like that. Now, very early in the story, he actually sends a very ominous message to the higher-ups, like at the SS, and it essentially just says, something is killing my men. Not someone, something is killing my men. So Verman's colleague/rival, who's a guy named Erich Kempfer, he's the Naziest Nazi to ever, like, wear a swastika. He's almost shades over into, like, a cartoon villain, but not quite. So he's kind of sent on a mission to sort out whatever the fuck is going on at the keep. Now, he's actually gunning for the very coveted position of commander at this new death camp that the Nazis want to set up in, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, but Ploiești, maybe, in Romania. And he hopes that by kind of like bringing a swift, decisive conclusion to whatever the situation is at the keep, he can actually get the desired promotion. He's kind of like in line for it, you know what I mean? There's also kind of another thing that's kind of spurring him to want this position. He wants to make his rival, Verman, who also happens to be the only person to ever witness him being a coward. He wants to make him look like an incompetent fool, like show him up because he's older. And, you know, like I said, he has kind of like some dirt on him. The problem, though, is that the ongoing state of affairs at the keep is a lot more complicated than it might first appear. Although when Kempfer gets there with his SS guys, he very arrogantly believes that the very gruesome murders of Verman's men can sort of be attributed to nothing more than like some local rebel groups. It soon starts to become very clear that the deaths are probably not caused by anything human. For one thing, the keep actually seemed completely harmless. Like, even all the villagers said, you know, there's no stories about, like, hauntings or, you know, nobody's ever died in there or nothing like that. So it seemed, like, completely harmless until two of Verman's soldiers, believing that the thousands of these kind of funny-looking T-shaped crosses that are, like, embedded on the inside of the stone walls, like, all over the place, they think that they were made of gold and silver, so they tried to pry one of them loose, and they found what appeared to be kind of like a secret passagey, shafty type situation behind there. And immediately after that happens, one of the men has his head torn off by some unseen force, and after that, like, the killings start sort of coming like thick and fast, almost as if something has been perhaps released from the bowels of the keep. So once the bodies start to pile up, the officers kind of like try and double up on security, keeping everyone awake all night and shit like that, but it doesn't really seem to do any good. There appears to be some kind of being or creature or something like that that is able to just kind of like emerge from the darkness, rip off people's heads and tear out people's throats willy-nilly, and then is able to like melt back into the shadows. They start tearing apart the keep to see if they can find out where this thing, whatever it is hiding. For a long time, they still do think it's a guy or a bunch of guys, but, you know, the longer it goes on and the weirder shit gets, because there's some shit with like some zombies, essentially, like people walking around that were already dead, then they're starting to think, okay, well, maybe there's like some supernatural shit going on here. So once they get to that point, unsure of what to do and losing at least, or averaging at least, losing a man a day to whatever this invisible menace is, the officers end up summoning a guy who's kind of like the foremost authority on the keep and also of the folklore of the region. And he's a scholar, like an older man named Professor Theodor Kuza. And he also happens to be Jewish, which, like I said, the Naziest Nazi is not super happy about having to take, information or trying to get help from a Jewish person. So he's a little cranky about that. Now, Kuza is a wheelchair-bound guy, and he's very, very ill, very infirm. He suffers from a kind of crippling disease. He can't really, like, his circulation is bad. He can't really use his hands, things like that. So when he's forced to come to the keep, because he is absolutely forced to come there, he's obliged to bring along his daughter, Magda, who is about 30 or 31. She's actually a scholar in her own right. She's a music scholar, and she's kind of put her own life largely on hold to serve as her father's caretaker. At the beginning of the story, she doesn't seem to care about this very much. She doesn't seem all that interested in like marriage or family or anything like that. She's very studious, and she's kind of like into that more than, you know, doing like, I guess, what back then would have been considered like stereotypically feminine things. Now, hovering around the edges of this core story, at least in the first half of the book, is this mysterious, for a time, unnamed red-haired man who seems to have some kind of connection to the keep, in the sense that when the whatever it is like breached, and, you know, the creature or whatever it is like comes out, he actually, even though he's like half a world away, he kind of psychically senses, oh shit, like something bad's I gotta get there. So interspersed with all the stuff going on with the Nazis and the scholars and everything like that, you have like this guy who, for a time, you don't really know who it is, trying to get to the keep without, you know, it's wartime, so he's trying to get there like without getting caught. So the setup of this part of the book is great. I mean, it's really chilling, it's very atmospheric, it's very page turning. You're just kind of like, holy shit, you know, and it's always fun to see the sort of like emissaries of the master race like trembling in fear as some unknown thing just starts picking them off one by one. You know, that never gets old, seeing Nazis having their heads ripped off their shoulders. And even though, you know, and I don't even know if like the back of the book says this, but I mean, the book is from 1981, so I think most people know that this monster is kind of like a vampire. It's not, it's more like a proto-vampire, because I think it's kind of like, this is the thing, like the real thing that vampires, like all the vampire legends are based on. So some of the vampire shit applies and some of it doesn't apply, so it's that kind of stuff. So even though you know that this is like a vampire adjacent monster, like pretty early on in the story, there's still like enough intrigue and tension and stuff like that to keep you invested. And I will say too that even though, and I've mentioned this before, I'm usually a big advocate of not over explaining your monster, I didn't even mind, and from here it's like kind of like, I'm not going to spoil the whole thing, but I am going to spoil some things that are plot points. So if you haven't read this, or if you haven't seen the movie or anything like that, then you might want to click off and either go read it or something like that. But if you don't care, then you can keep on going. So what I was saying was that I didn't even mind the sort of demystification, I guess, of the creature that took place, I guess, about halfway through the book, where it's revealed that the monster is actually a Moroi, which is kind of like a proto-vampire, like I said, or like a demon type deal. And at first it calls itself Radu Molasar. Like, it talks, it's actually like a person, you know what I mean? It's like a vampire. It's got like a cape on and shit like that. The main thing, though, that I think was interesting about this part, even though I was a little bit bummed out that I was kind of like, oh, you know, it was much creepier when you didn't really know what it was. I mean, you knew it was like a vampire thing, but you didn't really know much about it. Once it kind of started talking and came out dressed, it was like a little bit of a less scary, but I still liked this part of the story. Because the main thing that was interesting about this part of the story was the fact that Professor Kuza, who is actually like fascinated by the monster, because like I said, he's like a folklore scholar, and he's just like amazed that he's like, oh my god, this thing really exists, that's awesome. And he ends up like striking up something of an uneasy alliance with the monster, because the creature, he's essentially makes Kuza believe that he wants to wipe out the Germans. He's like, hey, this is my keep, I don't want these motherfuckers in here, and you're from this region, like you're from, I mean, he's really, really old, so he still calls it like Wallachia, but, you know, he's like, same diff, he's like, you're my countrymen, and these Germans are interlopers, so we're kind of like enemy of my enemy is my friend type thing. So it's like, we both want the same thing, we want these Germans out of here, we want to wipe them out. So there's that kind of thing. So he actually kind of like sets up, like I said, like an uneasy alliance with the monster. I also really liked the kind of underlying main conflict of the tale, that even though the monster promised to eliminate the Nazis, I mean, he says he's going to go to Berlin and kill Hitler and all this other stuff and sort of like end their campaign of terror, you eventually discover that letting the monster win in that way might actually be way worse than anything the Nazis could have done. So I like that this kind of like evil, but like, you know, yeah, but then like greater evil, you know what I mean? So I thought that was good. I know that's not like completely original, but I did like that angle on it. I also really liked the way that the monster was able to kind of like manipulate Professor Kuza, who was actually a very decent and honorable man, into doing his bidding. Was also very, very good, very insidious, and also like quite believable. So I thought that was cool. But I will say that once the red-haired man gets to the keep, because remember I said this red-haired man was been like trying to get there like for the whole first half of the book, and every now and then like you see things from his point of view. When he gets to the keep and it's discovered that his name is Glenn, that's not actually his real name. His real name is Glecken. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but that's kind of like what he tells everybody his name is. So when he shows up, I kind of feel like the story lost a little bit of steam. I mean, I still enjoyed it overall, but this is the point where it starts to go a little bit more like in a dark fantasy direction. And once Glenn is established as this sort of like ancient rival to the Moroi, and it goes toward a more fantasy style story like magic swords, ancient spells, that kind of stuff, I felt like the story lost a lot of the gothic creepiness it had when it was just like Nazis getting picked off one by one by like a scary monster that was like melting in and out of the shadows. Like that was the coolest part, like with the castle, the keep, and everybody getting like bumped off. I thought that was like really cool. Also could have done without the romance novel bits with Glenn and Magda, like them falling in love. Didn't really need that. But you know, it happens a lot like in these mainstream type horror novels where it's like, well, we have to like wedge a romance in there. And I'm not a big fan of that. You know, I'm not completely averse, but I don't really like romance novels, and I don't really like horror novels that have a romance aspect to them. There are, again, exceptions to that, but in general, I'm just kind of like, it didn't need to be in there. Although I understand why it was in here, because it added some kind of complication and also some more like motivation for Glenn in like what his ultimate goal was. You know what I mean? Like it kind of like made his mission like that much more difficult, that much more complicated, because he had fallen in love with this woman. So, I mean, I can see why this was such a bestseller and is so widely beloved. I mean, it's a pretty compelling read. It's very just like chock full of these eerie fog-shrouded castles in Eastern Europe, like up in the mountains. It's got spooky vampires. It's got reanimated corpses, Nazis getting fucked up. It's like, you know, those are all like cool things. It's not written like particularly elegantly or in a literary style or anything like that. It's pretty standard, straightforward way that I feel it, like every now and then like falls victim to kind of like mainstream pulp horror cliche, but that's okay. All in all, I actually really had a lot of fun with this one, and it actually made me want to revisit the film adaptation as well, which, as I mentioned, came out in 1983 and was directed by Michael Mann. As I said, the production of it was very, very troubled, and I feel like Michael Mann didn't like how the final version came out, because the shit that he shot, it was like I said, it was almost like 3 hours long, which is crazy for like a horror movie, but there's a lot of shit going on in this book, so I can kind of see why. But I think it got trimmed down by the producers to like an hour and a half, so he was like, and some people watching it that hadn't read the book were just like, what the fuck is going on? I can't really follow it, because it was like incomprehensible. And I will note too that F. Paul Wilson, the author of this book, really did not like the movie, and he actually ended up in 2005 writing his own graphic novel series, which was illustrated by Matthew Dow Smith, because he wanted to get his own like vision, like what the visuals of the book that he pictured, he wanted to get that on the page because he really wasn't happy with the movie adaptation. So there's that. But yeah, this was a really good one. If you really just like kind of like mainstream pulpy, like I said, like Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard or something like that, it is very much in that vein. Like I said, it starts off like the first half of it is kind of more gothic horror. It is a vampire story, but the vampire isn't exactly like a traditional vampire, although it does have a lot of traditional vampire tropes in it. But again, like about halfway, 3/4 of the way through, it goes a little bit, it goes more in like a dark fantasy direction, and there is kind of like a romance angle as well, which like I said, I wasn't a big fan of. Actually, I read like a lot of reviews that also weren't a big fan of that, so I guess like most people that are into horror were like, we don't want romance in the horror, god damn it, stop it. But yeah, but it didn't bother me too much. It wasn't that egregious, so it didn't bother me. So I really did like this one overall. So if you've read it, or if you've read any of the other ones in the adversary cycle and they relate anything to this one, like let me know, because from what I read read about the adversary cycle, and, you know, because like I said, I read the Tomb, and that doesn't have anything to do with the Keep. It's like a completely different story, completely different characters. And so I don't know if all the books are really all that interrelated, because this one just seemed like very much a standalone story that was kind of like retconned, and I guess they added some shit later on. But if you've read any of the other ones in the adversary cycle, let me know, because I actually am really interested. So that will do it for this book review, this Tomes of Terror, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.